Very good. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. We are going to go through a quick little tip or two about protecting your data, protecting your tax returns. We're kind of on the tail end of tax season, but all year round, we have customers and companies that come to us that are just in a real situation where they've got a ton of really important data laying all over the place, all over the internet, all over their computers. And that's what we're here to talk about how we can help you find a way to secure that, find the data, and get that shored up so that you're not opening yourself up to a lot of hackers just and making yourself easy prey for their attacks. So as we kind of wind up, if you have questions, we have a couple really critical and simple resources that you can find turnkeysol.com/guide. That is a really powerful, simple walkthrough of some simple steps that you can take to secure yourself, your personal information, your business, and kind of where to learn more. And then the other one is the book that we just wrote, that I wrote at the end of December. We got it finally published. It's been a long project, but it's Winning the Cyber War. And in there, we dig in a whole lot more deeper than we have time to today about a ton of different things that you yourself, your business, your family, everybody can use to protect yourself against these criminals that are out there trying to steal and destroy everything you've built. So that said, let's launch right into it. Again, it's not really a long conversation here today, but let's just keep it really simple and very high level. And let's just ask a really fundamental question that I thought might kind of paint the picture of why we care right now. Let me just ask you the simplest of questions. If you got a hold of somebody's social security number, now let's just say it's somebody that you don't know, and heck, let's even go further. Let's just say it's somebody that you don't even like. You really dislike them, and you got a hold of their social security number, their current and former addresses, their tax returns, their driver's licenses, the names of all their pets and dogs and cats, and you got all the information you could think of about them, like telephone numbers, where they've lived, all these little pieces of information that we call personally identifiable information. If you had all that data about somebody that you really didn't like, what could you do with it? Well, hopefully, and I trust that everybody here is and watching this is entirely honorable and has a strong sense of morals, and you would do nothing with it. You'd shred it, right? But if you were a criminal, if you were a thief, if that was just your modus operandi, what you would be looking at is a veritable gold mine. Everything about that person is accessible pretty much nowadays with enough information. If you think about yourself, if somebody had your social security number, your telephone numbers, your email addresses, all that information about you, they could probably walk up to the bank and impersonate you. They could certainly apply for mortgages. They could probably even take your house by transferring the title of your house or applying for mortgages on your house. So there's a ton of things that are possible that you don't want to have happen to you if the hackers get a hold of these pieces of information. So that's kind of fundamentally why it's so important that we secure these pieces of data, and why it's so important that we take really good care of where we put them. Now, I love this book, Oh, the Places You'll Go by Dr. Seuss. It was a fantastic book, kind of telling the story of this person who's about to go on this fantastic journey, and they're going to go all over these places. And I feel like we should have that conversation with our data nowadays, because nowadays where we put our data is just this massive slew of places. We no longer just store files on a hard drive. We no longer just put them in a file cabinet. Nowadays, we stick them on your hard drive in Google Photos, in iCloud, Amazon Photos, thumb drives, Dropbox, OneDrive, Google Drive, external drives. And this is like a very small list, okay? There are 1,000 places that we are putting our data and our most important stuff and our unimportant stuff and just all the things in the files that we create these days. And what's bonkers about this is that half the time we forget what we put where. The other half of the time, what we're seeing in the marketplace and working with our customers and just persons and family and friends and just everybody we talk with is that a lot of times that data is really not secured well at all. So you put stuff out there, you don't even remember putting it out there, and we're not securing it. So we got to have the conversation with you about, once we've put data in all of these places like the iCloud or the Google Cloud or thumb drives, or you store it on your cell phone, and well, where does it go when you put it on your cell phone? Well, it gets replicated out to the Google Cloud or to the iCloud or wherever, and it's not being protected adequately in those clouds or on whatever devices that gets backed up to and synchronized to. And hackers really love that. They really appreciate you putting your stuff all over the place. So I want to kind of step back for just a second and think, if you have all of your pictures storing in the iCloud or into the Google Cloud or into Amazon's Photo Cloud or wherever, and you have a really a weak password, then what? If you have a weak password protecting your iCloud, I should say, or your Google Cloud or your Amazon account, then what happens? It's a kind of a simple extension of what could possibly happen. But let's back up just a split second and think through that idea of a weak password. The mere definition of a weak password changes minute by minute because of crazy things like increased computing power, artificial intelligence, massive breaches where the hackers are finding your patterns and more information about you. But the idea of a weak password kind of keeps shifting down the road. If you look at the slides that we've got up on the screen, is a really powerful study, and this gets updated pretty much every year. But you can see that even a 12-character password with maybe upper and lowercase letters, and a 12-character password just a few years ago was considered really, really good, and like it was going to take a long time to crack. But a 12-character password with upper and lowercase letters is now, at today's computing power, like 6 years to crack. Okay, so that feels like a long time. But what about 11 characters? 1 month. What if you throw a number in there, 10 months? All right. And for a lot of you who are still using 8-character passwords places, which that like 5-10 years ago, that was the standard. That was the recommendation. Then if you look at 8-character passwords with a number, upper and lowercase letters, and a symbol, 5 minutes to crack that. And if it's password 1, PASSWORD1, I'm sorry, that's 9 characters. If they haven't guessed that already, or if they haven't stored that, your 9-character password, 6 hours to crack that, even with all the fun little things put in there. Okay, so the strength of your passwords that you're putting on those systems is incredibly important. And what we're now recommending is something way more than 12 characters, closer to like 40-50 characters, and really completely random. So to kind of continue that thought process, are you reusing passwords that you're storing your stuff in, like in your Amazon cloud, your iCloud, your OneDrive, your Office 365, your Dropbox, all these places where you've stored your data or accidentally replicated your data or synchronized to? If you're reusing those passwords in one place or others, or you're even using maybe a variable or a piece of it or a chunk of that password, then you really want to rethink that strategy. And just to highlight the reason why, is I put up just 5 months. We're in May now of 2023. And now in 2023, some of the biggest, most notable nationwide attacks that have caused data breaches where hackers have gotten passwords is in May, we're 5 days in now. They've already hacked T-Mobile again. In April, Pizza Hut and Kentucky Fried Chicken and Western Digital got hacked. In March, the U.S. House of Representatives, that's terrifying. In February, Activision, Atlassian, which is a huge software company, Reddit, T-Mobile in January, the first time, at least this year, MailChimp, Chick-fil-A, which was personally terrible for me, and Twitter. I don't know if anybody's still on Twitter, but their passwords are hacked. So just this year, some of the biggest names ever have been hacked, and we're 5 months and not even, just barely 5 months into the year. And if you're using a same password at Chick-fil-A that you use on your computer, or that you use for Amazon, or that you use for Google, or that you use for iCloud, if you're using the same or similar passwords, then the hackers can get in almost instantly. It's way simpler and way quicker for the hacker to use a stolen password than it is to crack it, even though cracking passwords is getting quicker and easier every second. So, how to protect your data. What I would start with is, and this is the meat and potatoes of this conversation, is 4 things. First, you got to list your places. Think through, where have you stored stuff over the years? Where are you storing it now? And this is sometimes a tricky conversation, because we've got to think, okay, well, what software do we have running on our computer? What do we have? What apps do we have installed on our phones? And where are they pushing data to? Like the Google password vault inside of Google Chrome naturally tries to push your passwords into the Google Cloud. So there you go. That's one place, the Google Cloud. If you have an Amazon account and you synchronize your pictures up there, then the Amazon cloud is a place where you store your data. And I'll talk about that in just a second. Search those places. Go into those things, those places, if it's a cloud system or a computer or a thumb drive or whatever, and search for stuff. Let me give you a simple example. On my computer, I pulled up OneDrive and I searched for the word tax. It's not, I'm not talking about anything really super complicated here. I pulled up, my OneDrive, and I looked for the word tax, and it pulled up all the places that I had tax returns. Now, I'll tell you why I'm not worried about that in a minute. Another example is I pulled up my Google Cloud, and just kind of a quick example here is I pulled up the photos in my Google Cloud, and I searched for, which, by the way, Google does an amazing job of indexing things, and they know exactly what kind of data. You could search for cat, by the way, in there, and it would pull up all the pictures of my cats. But it knows what the picture is. And if I looked in my Google Cloud for driver's licenses, it found all the pictures, all the times that I've had to scan a driver's license and send it to an insurance guy, or send it to a mortgage officer or something like that. So it is incredible how many places you will find things on your office server, I would suggest, or on your local workstation, or my documents. Search for payroll, or search for some strings of things like people's personal social security numbers from your office if you do payroll there at the company. But search those places for where you have for specific pieces of data, and then you'll know where they're at. Now, the third step is to delete or consolidate that information. Copies everywhere, and I try to tell people all the time, like if it was a really valuable gold coin, that's an asset that you own, right? A really valuable gold coin, chances are you have one copy of that gold coin, or your marriage certificate, or some other piece of a valuable asset. You only have one of those. With our files, we can accidentally have hundreds of copies of those things, because we've copied and pasted it and pasted it and pasted it in multiple places and worked with it and saved copies of that. So it's really simple to find there. Simple example of that is your sent items in your email, and that's a place where we find a ton of personal information over the years. So delete or consolidate to a secure place. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's think about this like a castle. We got to protect your crown jewels. If these assets are really, really, really important to you, and they're like your social security number, your credit cards, those kind of things, we got to protect them. We want to put them, if you need to save them online electronically somewhere, then put them in a single place. And my advice is to get rid of the duplicates, get rid of all the copies of those things you don't need. And then that one place, using the analogy of a castle here, that one place, we want to protect that place. So we consolidate all of our valuable assets to one place, and then we protect that place, like with MFA, with things that can encrypt it, like multi-factor authentication is one thing that makes it hard to get into it for the hackers, but encryption assumes that at some point or another you may actually get that hard drive stolen, or somebody may get that system, but if they can't decrypt it, it's still of no use to them. So that's an incredibly important thing too. And I didn't even talk about backup, but there's multiple things that you got to do to protect that one place where we're going to store your very valuable assets. But at the heart of it is we don't want to have 57 places where we're storing things, or 2 or 3 or 4, because it just gets harder and harder to guard those areas and those things, those systems, those places, when there's so many of them. So list your places, and we're going to wrap up here, is list your places, figure out, sit down and think, where do I store stuff? Where could I store stuff? Where do I accidentally or intentionally store stuff? Search those places for your data, delete or consolidate them to a secure place, and then secure that single place really well using things like unique, strong passwords, multi-factor authentication, and encryption. Okay, so it's pretty important. I can't tell you how many times, it's really pretty much every time we do an audit for a company or even existing customers, we find that people have started accidentally or intentionally saving very important stuff like their tax returns and their payroll files and their driver's licenses and all these important pieces of data about themselves or their employees or their coworkers or their vendors. They've been saving that in places that aren't secure and are very hard to defend. So that's it. That's it for the idea of how to protect and find that really incredibly important information. And we hope it was useful. What to do next, if you've got questions about this, is by all means, please call our office, 225-751-4444. If you're a current customer, you know how to put in a service ticket, by all means, please reach out to us. If you want us to help you scan and try to find those pieces of data, we're more than glad to help. If you want more information like this, email us at ask@tcas.la, ask@tcas.la, and get on our newsletter and follow us on Facebook and on our other social media for future webinars like this. And we hope this was helpful, and we hope you have a great day, and let us know how we can help. Thank y'all, and have a great day.